Hey everybody, and welcome to Bible class. My Bible is open to Exodus chapter 3. Can you find that? The second book of the Bible, Exodus chapter 3, where we continue to explore who is God. That's one of the most important questions anybody can ever ask. I want to start by thinking a little with you about how he is different than me. I'm different than him. But you're also very different from God. Have you ever seen one of these? Maybe you have one of these yourself, a passport. You need those if you're going to go out of the country. And every time you go into a new country or exit a country, you get a stamp. I have stamps in my passport from Canada and Israel and Egypt and a few other places. But do you know the very first thing I do when let's say I just went on a long plane ride and I'm a long ways away from home, the very first thing I do is pull out my phone and call home. Why? Because I'm not with them. I want to talk with them. I want to hear their voices. And I can't be in two places at once. What about you? No, you can't either. You can't be here at the church building and at home or at school at the same time. So we use phones because we can only be in one place at one time. What about, do you know anybody who's really good at making things? Maybe you've already walked through kitchens at home more than once today, and you went in and you grabbed a hold of one of those handles of the cabinet and you didn't even think about who made those. I couldn't do that. If I tried to do that and hang that on a wall, it would probably just fall right over. Or if something is happening in my car, I know how to put gas in it, but I'm not very good at fixing cars when they break down. Some people are, but none of us are good at everything. There are lots of things that I can't do. What about the smartest person who you know? There are plenty of people much smarter than me who know things that I don't know, but nobody knows everything except the God we're talking about in Exodus chapter 3. Now, your class teacher might talk with you a little bit more about the background, but this is when God comes to Moses and tells him, I want you to go down to Egypt. I'm going to use you to set my people free. Can you start reading with me in Exodus 3, verse 6, where God, our Creator, said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Why is that? Well, if we start thinking about the way God is talking, there are some pretty incredible things going on here. For instance, Moses knew, now you know, that Abraham had lived 600 years before Moses. You know what we learned from that? Well, it's a pretty good indicator to us that God has always been. Moses hadn't always been. Moses had a beginning. Abraham had a beginning. Abraham lived 600 years before Moses, and yet God talks about himself as having always been. Or look at verse 7 where the Lord says, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings. Okay. Well, it's easy for me and for you to read that, maybe not realizing that where Moses was at this burning bush, Egypt was more than 200 miles away. And yet God says, I see what's happening 200 miles away. I hear what is happening 200 miles away. Now, you and I, we have no idea what's happening right now in Illinois or in Italy. We can't be in two places at the same time. But God, this God, is everywhere, and He knows everything. I've seen, I know. In verse 8, He says, I have come down to deliver them, the children of Israel, out of the hand of the Egyptians. Now, Moses knew, he had grown up in this area. The Egyptians were strong, powerful people, the builders of the pyramids. In fact, those pyramids were already there before Moses was born. Would God be any match for the powerful Egyptians? Well, you might talk together as a class about how God showed just how powerful He was. We start reading about 10 terrible plagues, right? He turns the water in Egypt to blood, and He sends frogs all over the place. And then there are gnats, and there are flies that get all over everything, and all of the livestock everywhere, that the Egyptians have them get very sick, and eventually there are boils, terrible sores on all of the skin of the Egyptians, and there are incredibly large hailstones and locusts that come and eat everything up, and eventually terrible darkness, followed by that 10th most terrible plague of all, right? The death of the firstborn. This was God's way of showing, listen, I've come down to deliver the children of Israel out of the hand of the Egyptians. I'm going to bring them up out of that land to a good and a broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And there was nothing that Pharaoh or the so-called gods and goddesses of the Egyptians could do. Well, what about there was an entire sea between Egypt and this land that God was going to bring them into? That wasn't a challenge for God. He parts the waters of the Red Sea. It is a way of showing God can do anything. Moses in Exodus chapter 3 and verse 13 says to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is His name? What shall I say to them? And here is our key verse for tonight's class. God said to Moses in Exodus 3 verse 14, I am who I am. And He said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. What does He mean by that? Well, 4 simple points that I want you to talk together as a class about. I am. God has always been. You and I had a beginning, not God. I am. God is everywhere. If I travel a long ways away from home, I've got to pick up a phone or FaceTime or something like that to talk with my family. I can't be in two places at once. God is everywhere. There are lots of things I don't know. You don't know. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We don't know what's going to happen in the next hour, but God knows everything. There are plenty of things I'm not good at. Lots of things I can't do, but God can do anything. Don't you think it's worth us learning a little bit more about him? That's why we're in Bible class. And so I'm going to turn it over to your in-person class teacher, but I appreciate you learning a little bit more about who is God right along with me. Have a great rest of your class, a great rest of this week, and I'll see you real soon.